Hi, and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
And we are working our way through Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, right? The heading here is a subheading, rather, is a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. So he wants to tell us the best way, or a good way anyway, to discuss our Christian convictions with someone else without, getting ugly and getting into a war with someone and fighting and yelling and all that kind of stuff, right? And so we've looked at the first couple of chapters here. The first couple of chapters, he kind of set the tone and helped us to find out where he's coming from. Okay. Chapter 3 was an important chapter. That's the one that we just looked at. And because it introduces what he calls the mother of all tactics, right? And he calls it Columbo, right? And the basic idea here is to ask questions, right? And so that's what the Columbo Tactic does. And it allows us now to, he suggested that when an issue comes up, sometimes we have just a very short time period in order to respond, right? And so what do you do in those situations? Well, he wants us to be able to handle those types of things and to deal with them. And so he calls that the Columbo Approach, where you ask a question, right? And you ask a question to gather information, to reverse the burden of proof, right, and to lead the conversation in a specific direction. Mm-hmm. And so he now will go through each of those in the next few chapters to help us to understand what he's talking about. In other words, why do we ask questions? What kind of questions do we ask? And where we're headed with those questions.
All of part 1 falls under the Columbo Tactic. Yeah. That's how important and big and massive it is.
Yeah, good. So when Lieutenant Columbo shows up at a crime scene, the first thing that he does is gather the facts.
Right?
Like
any good detective.
Yeah. So in the same way, sometimes you'll need more information before you can proceed in a conversation. Right? Again, don't just make assumptions without understanding where the person is coming from. You need to gather information. Yeah. And so the best first question, this is the queen of all questions, I would say, in his approach here, is the question is, what do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. Right? What do you mean by that? Now notice how that takes the pressure off of you. Right? Yeah. They've made a claim, right? And so now you're just asking, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Right? Yeah. And so he says this is the best first question that, so put that one away, put that in our quiver there, and we can pull that out really quickly. And it allows now us to do all kinds of things that he's going to explain to us here as we go through this. Right?
Our awkward 15-year-old conversation, all his were questions of, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by, which God are you talking about? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by not logically?
Or reasonable, that kind of stuff.
The person on the bus, what do you mean by God can't preserve his word?
Yeah.
So those are all those things. He's going in and he's being his Columbo, and he's asking those questions. So there are kind of examples that he gives here, and to help illustrate the
what do you mean by that?
The gathering information. So someone might ask you, do you believe in evolution? So your rejoinder would be, what do you mean by evolution? Right? And it's not disingenuous.
Right.
They could be asking about something completely off topic. Yeah. It helps to steer the conversation into a better form for you, as far as like, well, okay, are you asking about microevolution, macro, solar? That simple question has a lot of baggage behind it, and so you're asking, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by evolution? And that helps to clarify where that person's coming from and why they might even be asking that question. Do you take the Bible literally? Well, that depends on what you mean by literally. What specifically were you thinking of? So again, just a different way of saying, what do you mean by literally? Mm-hmm. Great thing, and especially that question, because straw mans abound within that question. Science has proven there is no God. Really? Precisely how did science do that? If you've read with us through How to Be an Atheist, you know the issues with that. But maybe they have a specific area that they want to bring up, and so you might be better prepared to answer that specific thing than talk about, well, scientists come up with theories and it's really hard for them to disavow their theories because they came up with it and they have a presupposition involved. So allow them to answer the question. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
And you might even, as he said earlier in the previous chapter, you might get an education out of this, right? I mean, it's okay if, you learn some things along the way as you're working your way through these questions.
Right. Asking these questions isn't invasive. It's not accusatory. It's asking for more information, helping to clarify, and you're steering the conversation where you want it to go. That's all the purpose of the Columbo Tactic, because that's exactly what Lieutenant Columbo does. Mm-hmm. Or the final one, abortion is okay because fetus is a human, but not a person. Really? What's the difference between the two? And that is a big one. Nancy Pearcey in Love Thy Body really hones in on that separation as well. So asking a clarifying question to that might allow you to utilize information learned in her book there.
Yeah, good. And so notice all of these are kind of versions of what do you mean by that, right? Yeah. I mean, it applies to the specific question, but you're still really asking the same question. What do you mean by that? Yeah. So once you get that in your head as your initial, salvo into the conversation, that will be helpful. Now, what he says next is, don't be surprised when your question, what do you mean by that, is met with a blank stare, right? And crickets.
Or someone uses that on you.
Yeah. So he's going to talk to us about that in a later chapter. But he says, people don't know oftentimes what they mean much of the time, right? Often they're merely repeating a slogan that they've heard, that kind of stuff. And so, asking a question is the simplest way to kind of clear up the confusion, right? Confusion that they might have, and then the confusion that you would have in terms of trying to understand what they're trying to say. So it also gives you time to, size up the situation and gather your thoughts and that sort of thing. So we want the issues to be clear, right? So that everybody, it's kind of like working through a problem by putting everything on the table so that we can all take a look at it, right? So it's not ugly, it's not mean. You're not trying to make the person look silly or dumb or whatever, that sort of thing. We're trying to just clear up the issue. What do you mean by that, right? And if it's a slogan that they've, heard and that sort of thing and have never thought through, this is an opportunity now for you to minister to them in terms of helping them to think through exactly, what does that mean that they have just said, right?
We're using the Columbo Tactic. We're using the question, what do you mean by that? There are 3 reasons why this is important. First, you don't want to misunderstand the person you're talking with, right? So they might be throwing out a slogan that you've heard a million times before. You know exactly what to respond to them, but they mean something completely different. Right. Or they're just getting into the subject and, they're wanting to discuss with you because they know that you're a good Christian. And so, of course, Constantine wrote the Bible and throughout all the bad stuff. Everybody knows that. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Yeah. There are questions to unpack within there. And so they might not even be sure themselves, and you're wanting to understand where they're coming from. And that person's response might be, well, I was reading this book, or I was watching Joe Rogan last night, and that's a famous one for Joe Rogan. It always makes me just want to itch my teeth every time he talks about it, because he just needs somebody on there to correct him. It's terrible. Second, you don't want to misrepresent the person, right? So by asking this clarifying question, they're able to say, well, okay, I don't mean a fetus is not a person, but you know what I mean? Like, they can't feel pain, or, it's only later that you're able to, have brain function or whatever might be. So it allows that person to clarify themselves and for you to understand where they're coming from. And you're not attacking the straw man. You're not saying, oh, well, here's what you mean by it, and here's me knocking it down. And they're like, whoa,
that's not what I meant.
I wasn't even talking about that. So to prevent that, that's not what I was even talking about. This question of what do you mean by that helps to alleviate that.
So we might want to understand or define what we mean in terms of a straw man, right? So what we're talking about there is it's a logical fallacy, sure. And it's whenever you are answering a question, right, that wasn't, or an issue that's not the real issue, right? So a person has a particular position. They let you know their position. They give you their argument for their position. And then instead of dealing with that position, you either misunderstand it or are confused or whatever. And so you answer a different question and you attack a different issue. And so that's called attacking a straw man. It's not the real issue. It's not the real argument that the person had. We want to be able to deal with the real argument, the real issue that they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so we need to listen to what they're saying, right? So that we can understand where they're coming from. Right. We don't want to misrepresent them.
Right. And third, you don't want to misunderstand him. That is asking, what do you mean by that? Helps the other person to be clear in his or her mind what they're talking about. So, you want to be clear what they're saying. They want to be clear, and it kind of parses that that misunderstanding that you might have that happens with all conversations between people, especially people that you might not know fully, or even people that you do know that you want to keep friendships, but maybe you don't know as well. So that just helps. Yeah,
because oftentimes, as we mentioned, or as he has mentioned, they're just repeating a slogan. Yeah. Right? They don't even know what they mean by that.
It's just a clump of cells. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
So you don't want them to...
You're just a clump of cells.
Yeah. So you want them to... You don't want them to misunderstand themselves, right? What question are you really... Or what issue are you really asking is what you have here. Right. So, misunderstand the person. We don't want to do that. We don't want to misrepresent the person. And we don't want the person to misunderstand themselves.
Right. Maybe they have a real question. And that was just the hidden question to... get you to react.
Yeah. Or there is a real question that they haven't even thought about yet, and so you want to kind of draw that out, kind of thing, right? So he tells us that we shouldn't underestimate the power of the question. What do you mean by that, right? So use it often, he says, right? So practice it. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that, right? He says use it also often. It'll keep you engaged in productive conversation while keeping the focus and the pressure on the other person and not you. Now, again, he's going to talk to us a bit about, when they ask us to defend our position. Right. But if a person makes a claim, the rules of engagement suggest that they are responsible to defend that claim and not just assume that everybody knows what they're talking about and that sort of thing. And so you make a claim, the pressure's on you to defend it. Right.
And so he says, look at what you've accomplished by just asking, what do you mean by that? Yeah. First, you immediately engage the non-believer in an interactive way, right? It creates a dialogue. Second, you show a genuine interest in the other person's view, which is also important. You are wanting to respond to their question. You're not just wanting to preach or be heard or say what you think they're saying. You're actively engaged in the other person's view. And third, you urge him to think more carefully about what he does. And fourth, you get a free education. Hey, that might be the case. Finally, there's no pressure on you. You're in the driver's seat. By asking that question, you can kind of drill down even more about where you might be comfortable to respond to. So again, you're Lieutenant Columbo. You don't want to spook the murderer into fleeing. You want to think that they've gotten away with it. And so, well, hold on. Let me ask you a question. What do you mean by that?
Right. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So that's chapter 4. Right. And it has to do with gathering information.
One of 3 parts to the Columbo Tactic. Yeah.
The next part to the Columbo Tactic is in chapter 5. And this one is entitled Reversing the Burden of Proof. Right. He says, many challenges to Christianity thrive on vague generalities and forceful but vacuous slogans. In other words, they're empty and they don't mean anything, right?
And sometimes on the other side,
they're vague, right? Nobody knows really what they're talking about or what the slogan is or that sort of thing. And so many challenges, he says, to Christianity thrive on these types of things. And so he asks us, how do we help others to move more explicit, to be more explicit about their reasons for their views? How do we keep them intellectually honest, right? So that's what we want to do next. We want to make sure that we help people to be honest about their particular views and to ask them really how do they defend their views, right? What are the reasons for their views? And so he says this second step of Columbo will help. It's called reversing the burden of proof.
Right.
Again, when a person makes a claim, it is their responsibility to be able to defend that claim.
Right. So kind of think of like a tennis match. They've served the screamer to you. They think they've got the ace. I know that tennis terminology, and instead of you trying to smash it right back to them, you're lobbing it back by using the question, well, what do you mean by that? And so that assertion that they've gone to, Constantine was the one that created the Bible. Respond to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, okay. Now you're responding to what they think you mean and what information you might have pieced together by kind of knowing about that, but then you might get off tangent a little bit, and so they've just created a argument for you to respond to, where they're the ones that made the assertion.
Yeah, they made the claim.
Yeah.
So it's not your responsibility to defend their claim,
Right.
Or to even refute their claim. First, you need to understand where they're coming from, right?
So you're going to volley. You're going to volley and hit it back to them and put the burden of proof back on them. So what do we mean by reversing the burden of proof? Well, the burden of proof is the responsibility of someone to defend or give evidence for his view. Yeah. And so if you've seen kind of formal debates, they'll structure kind of the topic of the debate in an affirmation of something so that the person who's responding is responding in the negative or the positive. So the burden of proof rests on who's ever making the assertion. And so generally the rule can be summed up this way. Whoever makes the claim bears the burden. Mm-hmm. You have to prove that Constantine was the one that changed the Bible.
Yeah.
Not me to tell you that you're wrong about Constantine changing the Bible. Yeah. What do you mean by that? Yeah. So again, ask a question. You're engaged. You're not trying to belittle the person. Asking just what do you mean by that gives them the burden of proof back on them. They've made the assertion. You don't have to respond to that. They do. Yeah. Good.
And so. A natural impulse, he tells us, for more aggressive Christians is to take up the challenge, right, and attempt to prove the other person wrong.
Yeah.
He says, don't do it. Right? If
you try, it's harder, right?
Yeah. He says, if you try to do that, you're just giving him a free ride because now, they don't have to defend their claim. And so, this is, I think, one of the major issues and the differences between presuppositional apologetic and evidentialism and other kinds. Oftentimes, folks are making these assumptions and they're not being challenged with regard to, that particular assumption, right? Reason. We have to be reasonable. Okay, well, fine. Now we want them to say, okay, what's the basis of reason? Where did it come from? What's the source of reason? That sort of thing. Right. So we don't let them get by with just assuming that reason is something that we all use and can use, and that it exists and that sort of thing. Well, where did it come from?
Yeah. Oh, right? you believe in miracles? God could just topsy turvy the entire universe if He did exist and created miracles. Well, hold on. You have to respond to where you think this. This standard comes by where we're able to know, future events from past events, or you're the one that's going to have to explain why science is universal, why it can't just change in a universe of change. Yeah. And so again, as Tony was saying, that it puts the same burden on them that they do on you for explaining where your explanatory power comes from. Right.
Good. Or, in ethics, right? God is evil. Okay, well, what's your standard, right? How did you come to that? Why is that the standard?
Yeah.
Right?
So using this tactic, what do you mean by evil is perfectly responsible. Yeah. And you are driving the conversation to wanting to ask, well, by your standard, what do you mean something is evil if, the universe winked into existence and there's no lawgiver behind it. What do you mean by evil? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So as he says here, at least for aggressive Christians, the natural impulse is to kind of jump on it like a dog on a bone, right?
Yeah, especially if you know the subject.
Yeah. He says, don't do this, right? We're letting them off too easily, right? He says the key here is not to allow yourself to be thrust into a defensive position when the other person is making the claim. It's not your duty to prove him wrong. It's his duty to prove his view is correct, right? I mean, if they make a claim, again, if initially it's their responsibility to prove that their particular claim is correct. And so don't get trapped into this, I need to prove him wrong, I need to prove him wrong. No. They need to prove that their position is correct. So you're reversing the burden of proof, right? Mm-hmm. Right?
He says, it's not your job to refute every story a skeptic can spin or every claim he can manufacture, right? You can just keep hitting balls in you, and you're just juggling them. Yeah. If he makes the claim, then it's his responsibility to give reasons why anyone should take his claim seriously. Don't allow yourself to be thrust into a defensive position if you're not advancing a view. Place the burden of proof where it belongs on the one who's making the claim. No more free rides. Yeah. That's the rule from now on.
All right.
Good. So what do you mean by that? Asking questions, you're advancing the plot. And so that's what we're doing. So as noted earlier, an argument is a specific kind of thing, right? An argument is not merely assertion or opinion or an explanation. Think of an argument like a house. And this is the one Greg Koukl uses of you don't just set a roof on top and say you're done,
or set a roof on the ground.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I put a roof on the ground, so there's my house.
Yeah. Then we get into forms and platonics and all the fun stuff of early philosophy. But what's a roof supported by? It's supported by a wall. Well, the roof is kind of the conclusion, right? It's the assertion, and the walls are the supporting ideas, the reasons to believe those conclusions, and us presuppositionalists want to talk about the foundation.
Yeah.
Good foundation laid out is where you want to kind of start. But if you're just asking, what do you mean by that? You're asking them, what are the walls that you're putting up? Not what the conclusion is. Yeah. It's the why do you believe that? Why do you think the roof can be supported by those walls? You know, the three little pigs, put the roof on top of the straw, probably not going to sustain the huffs and the puffs, but on bricks, more likely. So that's the idea here.
Right. So notice many people try to build their roof right on the ground instead of erecting a good solid wall, right? And so again, the walls are reasons to believe that the conclusion, the roof is true, right? So the roof is the conclusion, it's the main claim, and the walls then are the reasons to believe that so they support the conclusion, right? And so our job is to recognize that when the roof is lying flat on the ground, and just point it out, right? You haven't built any walls, by the way, with regard to your claim. So we need to ask for reasons or facts for them to support their conclusion, from them to support their conclusion.
So think about it this way. The Bible was written by Constantine, is the roof on the ground. And so if you just took it and ran with it, you're saying, okay, hold on, let me build my foundation. Okay, I have God's word, and then I'm putting this up, showing the 5,000 different manuscripts that we can turn to before Constantine, and you're building the walls, and you're going to set the roof of, and that's why we can believe the Bible.
Right.
Their roof is still on the ground.
Yeah.
You've just built a house for them. You don't need to do that. And all they're going to say is, well, okay, it wasn't Constantine, but it was definitely the early church throughout the things. And,
they'll continue to lob balls at you there, right? That kind of stuff. Another story they'll spin.
I read Bauer's hypothesis, and he says this. And so, okay, well, here's this book that I read by Kruger, and he makes this claim and this claim, and you've just built another house. And they're just able to make these roofs where they haven't built any houses. You've built them all for him. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're wanting to kind of get away from. So our second Columbo question is designed to enforce the burden of proof rule. And that question is, how did you come to that conclusion? The question effectively shifts the burden of proof onto the challenger where it belongs.
Yeah.
How did you come to that conclusion? What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion?
Right. So there are two very, very important questions in our arsenal in terms of dealing with these types of situations. What do you mean by that? You're trying to dig out and furrow out the what they're talking about, clarifying that sort of thing. And now this one. Okay, fine. Now we're clear in terms of what you're talking about. How did you come to that conclusion?
Right.
So we're asking for walls, right?
And you're still following the same rules. You're asking engaging questions. You're going to get an education if that person knows more.
Yeah.
You're clarifying where they're coming from so that you can actually deal with the wall that they're presenting you.
Yeah.
You're clarifying to themselves, to the person asking what they're actually talking about. So we're all on the same page here. So reversing the burden of proof is not this trick to avoid defending your own ideas. When we give opinions, we have to answer for them just like anyone else. Yeah. We have a responsibility, but so do they. Right. So, we could say, I like chocolate ice cream. Well, why do you like chocolate ice cream? No. You have to tell me why I like chocolate ice cream.
Or why I shouldn't like chocolate ice cream. Tell me why I shouldn't like chocolate. Well, wait a minute. No, you're the one, you're the one that made the claim you like chocolate ice cream. So why do you like chocolate ice cream? How'd you come to the conclusion that chocolate ice cream was the best ice cream?
Right. Right. And so if that's just, about chocolate ice cream, and it's like, well, because it tastes good. Okay. That's a wall. Yeah. But, when it comes to, God isn't real because, he's just a product of Mesopotamian goat herders who just made him up to not be scared of the lightning. Okay, how did you come to that conclusion? Yeah, because that Mesopotamia that sounds like a big word to me, and goat herders that sounds like inflammatory language. So that seems like it's coming from kind of a bumper sticker. Yeah. Sky fairy, spaghetti, flying spaghetti monster, all those nifty fun atheistic terminology to kind of throw you for a loop. So that's what it is. How did you come to that conclusion? Yeah. We're reversing the burden of proof. That's our lob back. What do you mean by that? Is the rejoinder, and then they come back with the assertion they're trying to build the roof, and you say, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Yeah,
good. And so, these are two very, very, very powerful questions and tactics.
And not disingenuous.
Right, exactly. Right. You're having a conversation. Right, yeah. It's a dialogue, right? And you're not being mean and ugly and that sort of thing, right? So when someone says to you, the Bible's been changed so many times, right? Or you don't need God to have objective morality, right? Or there's an infinite number of universes.
Hey, all right.
And ours just happens, to be one that looks designed, right? Well, we don't need to retreat in silence, right? Instead, he says, we just raise our eyebrows and say, how'd you come to that conclusion, right?
Right.
And that then is the second of the Columbo questions in terms of reversing the burden of proof that he wants us to understand, all right?
So, how did you come by that conclusion, and what do you mean by that? Yeah. Well, there you go. There's the tactic, part 1 and part 2. Part 3 is the kind of going to be a clarifying one, and we'll hit the final part to the Columbo questions here. And again, we're gathering information. That's what our first question does, is saying, what do you mean by that? And our second one is to reverse the burden of proof. Doesn't allow them to just get away with making an unsubstantiated claim. How did you come by that conclusion? What do you mean by that? How did you come by the conclusion? Those are the two big volleys that you're going to be suggested to make, instead of just jumping right into the fray.
And he says that reversing the burden of proof, notice, is not a trick to avoid defending our ideas. When we give opinions, we have to answer for it.
Sure, right.
And just like anybody else. And so he says we have a responsibility, but so do they. Right. And that's his point. Right. If we make a claim, we have the responsibility to defend it. If they make a claim, they have the responsibility to defend it. So he says, simply ask yourself, did the person give me an argument, that is, reasons to believe that the conclusion is true, or did they just give me an opinion? Right. And of course, if they give you just an opinion, you want to know, well, what are the reasons why you believe that, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of thing. And so he says when he answers you, when a person answers you, we need to be alert to the difference between what was asked in terms of an argument for their position or just an opinion. And so this question, how did you come to that conclusion? Mm-hmm. Helps us now if we believe they've just given us an opinion and not really an argument to prove their case, right?
Right. Yep. having a conversation. That's the whole point of it. That's what hopefully they're engaging in, and hopefully that's what you're engaging in as well. And again, this might be the only time that you have with the person, and so clarifying even their position within their own mind might get them to ask those questions as well. And so they might bring that up to you when they meet you on the bus next time. Hey, I thought about my Constantine claim before, and you asked, well, how did I come by that? And I just saw it on Joe Rogan, so I decided to do a little bit of research on it, and yeah, I was a little bit off on that. So, but you know, why should I trust the Bible? So there's that rock
in the shoe that you put there, right? And now it irritated them, and now they have to deal with it, right? Yeah.
So that's it for these two chapters, chapter 4 and chapter 5. We'll probably do 6 and 7 next time, maybe 6, maybe only 7. Again, depends on how much we talk. And hopefully this is beneficial to you. If it is, we'd love you to tell other people about it, to share our content. For YouTube stuff, we take out clips from the show and make it easier to digest in simple forms to share. It highlights the main points of what we're talking about. So you're even getting a highlight of a highlight because we're highlighting the book. And so, you know, we're doing what we can to blow off the dust of these great books that we've been covering, and hopefully you've been enjoying it. And so, you know, appreciate the likes, the reviews, become a Patreon supporter, patreon.com/GiveItTheCross. Keep the lights on for a little bit. Keep us swimming in books, because we don't have enough of them, because we don't have all of them. That's why. So once we get them all, then we'll all be good, and you know, we'll sit at home for the rest of our lives. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.